20. Tyrrell's confession. Sir James Tyrrell was in France when Bosworth was fought. Henry VII, on his accession, deprived him of his offices and Welsh estates, but restored them in February 1486, by which time Tyrrell had crossed from Calais to offer the new king his allegiance. He fared much better than most of those who had faithfully served Richard III. In the summer of 1486, the king, of his own volition, ordered 2 pardons to be issued to Tyrrell. There is no evidence that these related to the murder of the princes, as has sometimes been suggested, and they were probably concerned with his misplaced loyalty to Richard III. In July, Tyrrell was reappointed governor of Guisnes in the Pale of Calais, and left England, having accepted lands in France in lieu of his Welsh estates. He remained in Guisnes for 16 years, rendering faithful service to the king. He served as Henry's emissary on several diplomatic missions to the courts of Europe, and was created a Knight of the Body, a royal councillor, and constable of Guisnes. He visited England on occasion and took part in a tournament held in 1494 in celebration of Prince Henry's creation as Duke of York. Tyrrell also refused to become involved with any pretender and was praised by the king for his faithfulness. But in the summer of 1501, Tyrrell stepped out of line. The late John de la Pole, Earl of Lincoln, who had died fighting at Stoke in 1487, was the eldest of several sons born to Elizabeth Plantagenet, sister of Edward IV, and widow of the Duke of Suffolk. Lincoln's next brother, Edmund, was allowed by Henry VII to inherit the earldom of Suffolk, but not the dukedom, because he had not the means to support it, and this rankled. The new earl was a hot-headed, impetuous fool with grand designs on the throne of England, and in July 1501 he went voluntarily into exile in Flanders, with his brother Richard, hoping to obtain support for their cause from Maximilian. On their way they visited Sir James Tyrrell, who had probably known them as children during Richard III's reign and earlier, and he unwisely offered them assistance. Sir Richard Nanfan, deputy lieutenant of Calais, found out what Tyrrell had done, and that he had done it in the full knowledge that Suffolk was planning to overthrow Henry VII. This was treason of the first order, and Nanfan duly reported what he knew to the council in London, though Henry VII at first refused to believe it, and others accused Nanfan of maliciously seeking to do Tyrrell harm. However, when Sir Robert Curzon, described by Virgil as an agent of the king, laid before the council information which corroborated Nanfan's allegations, Henry had to accept that Tyrrell was guilty, and not only Tyrrell, because there was now evidence that Lord William Courtenay, husband of the Queen's sister Catherine, William de la Pole, Suffolk's brother, and others were involved. The king suspected a far-reaching conspiracy against him, and in October 1501 ordered the arrest of all concerned, who were then publicly proclaimed traitors. Suffolk and his brother Richard were out of reach. Suffolk was not arrested until he was extradited to England in 1506, and not executed until 1513, and Richard de la Pole remained abroad, a thorn in the side of the Tudors, until he was killed at the Battle of Pavia in 1525. But William de la Pole was incarcerated in the Tower and remained there in relative comfort until his day 38 years later. Other conspirators, including Courtenay, were also imprisoned. A luckless few were executed. If that wasn't clear, that was Pole's death 38 years later. His death, 38 years later. Early in 1502, Henry VII, angry because Tyrrell was still at liberty in Guisnes Castle, insisted that he be apprehended without delay. Tyrrell refused to surrender to the king's officers and began to prepare the castle for a siege as the Calais garrison, loyal to Henry VII, took up its position outside the walls. Then Richard Fox, Bishop of Winchester and Lord Privy Seal, asked to speak with Tyrrell and was admitted to the castle, where he promised him, in the king's name, a safe conduct to England, assuring him he was in no danger. Tyrrell at length agreed to go with him, but he refused to surrender the castle, leaving his son Thomas to hold it against the king's force. In Calais harbor a battleship waited to convey Tyrrell to England. He boarded it under escort and was soon in conversation with John Lord Denham, the Lord Treasurer, when the captain of the guard informed him that unless he ordered his son to surrender Guisnes Castle, he would be thrown overboard without delay. Tyrrell complied, and both he and his son were arrested on board ship and put in chains. On arrival in England, both were sent to the Tower. Very truth is, writes Moore, and well known, that at such time as Sir James Tyrrell was in the Tower for treason, both Dighton and he were examined and confessed the murder of the princes. But whither the bodies were removed they could nothing tell, for they too had been misled by tales of a reburial. No official record or transcript of Tyrrell's confessions survives today, but it must have existed at one time, because Moore describes it as his chief source, implying that he had seen it, and the details in his account, which occur nowhere else, argue its authenticity. Moore may also have obtained some information from Mary Tyrrell and other inmates of the minories once more. Moore may also have obtained some information from Mary Tyrrell and other inmates of the minories, and from John Dighton. Bacon says that after being interrogated, Dighton was set at liberty and granted a pension on condition that he left England and took up residence in Calais. He also states that Dighton was the principal means of divulging this tradition. Moore, writing in the reign of Henry VIII, seems to have traced Dighton, for he knew he yet walks alive and in good possibility to be hanged ere he die, which suggests he had either returned from exile without permission or was living a life of crime. Dighton's interrogation could only have taken place if Tyrrell had revealed details of the murder and his accomplices under questioning. Otherwise, why would the government have gone to the trouble of tracing and examining Dighton also? Moore implies in his account that Henry VII himself had divulged the contents of Tyrrell's confession, and had disclosed that Dighton was still alive and free. Bacon says the king gave out that the statements of Tyrrell and Dighton corroborated each other. However, there is no extant record of any public statement being made by the king about the death of the princes, which argues that Henry VII probably gave out his information to his trusted advisers, only many of whom were known to More. More's account became accepted as the truth by every Tudor writer on the subject. Thanks to More, we have a good idea of what was in the confession, and the striking thing about More's account is that it substantiates many of the rumors from as far back as 1483, and also the circumstantial evidence dating from Richard III's reign. The revisionists have frequently disputed the fact that Tyrell ever made a confession, but without backing their claim by convincing arguments. Here, after all, was an eyewitness account of the murder of the princes, and it was believed to be the truth by a man of great learning and integrity, who was in a position to check its veracity. Such powerful evidence cannot easily be ignored. It has been suggested that Tyrell was forced into making a confession to suit Henry VII's purposes. If so, why did he involve Dighton? It is far more likely that Tyrell, facing death with nothing to lose and the hope of absolution and thereafter heaven, was only too relieved to unburden himself. He was not necessarily looking for a reward, nor coerced by fear, but perhaps seeking the salvation of his soul. It is also significant that he was never charged with collusion in the murder. It has been suggested that Henry VII fabricated this confession. If so, why did he not use it for propaganda purposes? Why bother to go to such trouble for nothing? There are very good reasons for accepting Tyrrell's confession as genuine, but the fact remains that Henry VII did not publicize or make use of it. It would seemingly, for many reasons, have been to his advantage to accord the wildest publicity to the information he had received, which he had, after all, been seeking for years. Nevertheless, there were equally compelling reasons why the confession should be suppressed. Firstly, it would be in keeping with Henry's general policy of least said soonest mended, with regard to the history of the House of York. Secondly, the king was hoping to preserve that precious alliance with Spain. Prince Arthur had just died, and Henry was hoping to marry his widow Catherine of Aragon to the young Duke of York, now heir to the throne. But her father, King Ferdinand, had in the past expressed deep concern over the insecurity of the English crown. It was because of that Henry had had Warwick executed. Therefore, in the spring of 1502, the last thing that Henry wanted was adverse publicity about the fate of the princess, especially since his son was not yet 11, and he himself was beginning to suffer symptoms of the disease, either cancer or tuberculosis, that was later to kill him. Thirdly, the murder of the princes had been very much to Henry's own advantage. Should he publicize Tyrrell's involvement, people would view Tyrrell's previous steady advancement under Henry VII as highly suspicious, seeing it as a reward for carrying out the murder on Henry's behalf. Henry had suffered enough public opprobrium for the killing of Warwick, and he dared not now accuse Tyrrell, his faithful servant for 16 years, for fear that people would lay the murder at his own door. He had seen what such rumors had done to Richard III's reputation. It was one thing to learn that the princes were really dead, but quite another to be known to have favored their murderer. Lastly, Henry's chief motive in having Tyrrell questioned had probably been his desire to trace the bodies of the children. Had he been able to do this, he could have made out that the discovery of their remains had resulted from a search that he himself had ordered, and Tyrrell's involvement need never have been referred to. But Tyrrell, of course, firmly believed that the bodies had been removed to an unknown grave, or even, if rumor spoke the truth, buried at sea. It is unlikely, therefore, that Henry ordered a search to be made at the original burial site, as the bodies of the children were not found. Hence, the confession was virtually worthless to Henry. Without the bodies, he was still no further forward. The fact that Henry VII made no use of Tyrrell's confession therefore argues its authenticity. It's because from official records and Virgil's history proves how politically sensitive the issue still was. Only years later was More able to find out the truth about it, and even then his sources were reluctant to be identified. Clearly the issue was still a sensitive one when More's book was written, and this may well be the reason why it was written for private circulation only. On the 2nd of May, 1502, Sir James Tyrrell was arraigned on a charge of high treason. His indictment specified that his crime was his traitorous association and correspondence with Suffolk. No mention was made of the murder of the princes. Tyrrell was found guilty, and on the 6th of May was beheaded on Tower Hill, apparently without making any speech to the watching crowd. A day later his son Thomas was also condemned to death, though Henry VII was merciful and spared his life. 3 years later, Thomas Tyrrell managed to secure the reversal of the attainder on his father and himself. 21. The skeletons in the tower. Because Tyrrell's confession was suppressed and More's account of it remained long unpublished, the fate of the princess in the tower remained a matter for speculation during the reigns of Henry VII and Henry VIII. More himself says that their deaths had so far come into question that some remain yet in doubt whether they were in King Richard's day destroyed or no. It appears then that there were some who believed that the princes were not dead, and others who believed that Henry VII had murdered them. As we have seen, More, who had no reason to like Henry VII, was firmly on the opinion that Richard III was the guilty party. After More's book was published, it rapidly gained acceptance as the most veracious account of what had actually happened, and became the basis of all subsequent memoirs on the subject of the princes, written during the Tudor and early Stuart periods. Shakespeare's play, Richard III, derived its plot from Holinshed, who based his chronicle on Hall's, who used More's history almost word for word in his own chronicle. Between them, More and Shakespeare did more than any other writers to publicize Richard III's evil reputation. By Shakespeare's time, Richard had become the arch-villain, capable of any crime, however terrible. More's history is a moral tale about tyranny. Shakespeare's play is a study of evil. No further searches were made in the tower for the bodies of the princes. Yet Edward V and York were not the only children to disappear in that grim fortress during a turbulent age. In November 1539, when Henry VIII sent his cousins Henry Courtenay, Marquess of Exeter, and Henry Pole, Lord Montague, to the Tower on a charge of conspiring to overthrow him. He ordered also the imprisonment of all the other members of their families, including their sons, Edward Courtenay and Henry Pole, both aged 12. Both Exeter and Montague went to the block. Afterwards the king ordered that Lady Exeter, her son Henry Pole, and Henry's aged grandmother, Margaret Pole, Countess of Salisbury, daughter of Clarence and mother of Lord Montague, remain in the Tower. His Yorkist cousins had been a thorn in Henry's side for many years, and his former warmth towards the family had changed rapidly to bitter loathing after Cardinal Reginald Pole, Montague's brother, had written a virulent tract denouncing his marriage to Anne Boleyn. Where the Pole family was concerned, Henry VIII now acted like a man obsessed, and this explains why he extended his vindictiveness to the innocent sons of Exeter and Montague, who had played no part in any treasonable conspiracy. And why? Because he was a Pole. Young Henry fared worse than Edward Courtenay. In 1541, a northern rebellion against the king gave Henry the excuse he needed to execute the aging Countess of Salisbury, who was informed of her impending doom only a short time beforehand, and whose sentence was carried out with horrific butchery. Henry Pole, then aged 14, was expected to follow her to the block, but even Henry VIII dared not risk alienating public opinion. Already shocked at the fate of Lady Salisbury by putting so young a person to death, instead he ordered that the boy be placed in solitary confinement, and refused to allow him a tutor. Although the cousin Edward Courtenay enjoyed such a privilege, the king intended that Henry Pole be poorly and strictly kept, and not desired to know anything. Such treatment was not dissimilar to that meted out by Henry VII to Warwick half a century earlier. Edward Courtenay remained a prisoner until he was released by Mary I in 1553, but it is certain that Henry Pole never left the Tower. He was alive in 1542, as a record of payment for his meals attest, but after that he disappears from the records, and it can only be assumed that he died in the Tower, an event that would without doubt have been welcomed by Henry VIII. Henry Pole may have died from natural causes, or as a consequence of the rigors of his imprisonment. It has been suggested by several modern writers that he was starved to death. Certainly there was no one close to him left alive to ask awkward questions, and it may well be that Henry VIII, once the furor about the execution of Lady Salisbury had died down, decided to be rid of her grandson. However he died, there were now at least 3 children buried in the Tower. For all we know, Henry Pole's bones may lie there still. More than 60 years passed. Henry Pole was forgotten, but the tale of the princess became an established part of Tudor folklore. The Tudor dynasty ended with the death of Elizabeth I in 1603, to be replaced by the Scottish Stuarts in the person of James VI, and first great-grandson Okay, this is how this reads. The Tudor dynasty ended with the death of Elizabeth I in 1603, to be replaced by the Scottish Stuarts in the person of James VI and I, great-grandson of Henry VII's daughter Margaret. You make it out. Between 1603 and 1614, during the time that Sir Walter Raleigh and Lord Grey de Wilton were prisoners in the Tower, a man called John or Jonathan Webb found in an underground pipe or tunnel within the Tower what were thought to be the bones of the princes. However, it was quickly established that the bones were those of an ape from the Tower menagerie, who had somehow climbed into the tunnel, became trapped there, and perished. The French chronicler Molinet had stated in the late 15th century that the princes had been walled up in a secret chamber within the Tower, and left there to starve to death, a statement made by Mr. Johnson and preserved in volume LXXXIV of Archaeologia records not only the findings of the bones of the ape, but also the discovery in 1647 of the skeletons of two children aged about 6 and 8, and thought to be male, in a small room 7 or 8 feet square, which was found behind a wall in the passageway of the king's lodging in the royal apartments of the Tower. The room had been sealed, and the children apparently left there to perish. Those present, when the discovery was made, assumed that the bones were those of the princes, although the estimated ages of the children appear to make this unlikely. Unfortunately, there is no way of proving or disproving the theory, because there is no further mention of these bones in the records. During the 1650s, Oliver Cromwell ordered that the old medieval royal apartments to the south of the White Tower be demolished. The job, however, was only half completed at his death, and the ruins stood undisturbed until 1674, when Charles II decided to have the site cleared of all contiguous buildings. In an upper story of the White Tower may be found the chapel of St. John the Evangelist, one of the most perfectly preserved examples of Norman architecture in existence. It was a favorite place of worship of the medieval kings of England, who had their own private means of access to it by way of external castellated turret on the left-hand corner of the White Tower facing the river. This turret, estimated to have been about 20 feet square, and to have stood at 2/3 of the height of the keep, housed a stairway lit by 2 lancet windows, which led up to the door 14 feet above ground level. This is the door through which visitors to the White Tower enter today. The door used to open onto a landing from which arose a spiral staircase leading to the chapel. Today this staircase is walled up. In 1674, this turret or forebuilding was crumbling, and the workmen engaged by Charles II demolished it. Then they began to dismantle the staircase, the foundations of which went very deep. On the 17th July 1674, just as the task was nearing completion, the workmen made an astonishing find. The contemporary accounts of what they discovered are not as precise as we would wish, but they make it clear that whilst digging at the base of the staircase, or in or near its foundations, the workmen came upon a wooden chest at a depth of 10 feet below the ground. Inside the chest were the skeletons of 2 children. The taller child lay on its back, the smaller face down on top of it. It was immediately assumed that these were the bodies of the princes in the tower. An anonymous eyewitness wrote, "This day I, standing by the opening, saw working men dig out of the stairway in the White Tower the bones of those two princes who were foully murdered by Richard III. They were small bones of lads in their teens, and there were pieces of rag and velvet about them. They were," he adds, "fully recognized to be the bones of the two princes." 20 years later, the 1695 edition of Camden's Britannia carried the note that the bodies of the princes, though some have written they were put into leaden coffin and cast into the black deeps by the Thames, mouthed by Sir Robert Brackenbury's priest, were found on July 17th, 1674, by some workmen who were employed to take up the steps leading to the chapel of the White Tower, which in all probability was the first and only place they were deposited in. The discovery provided the most compelling corroboration of Sir Thomas More's account of the prince's first burial. The bones had been found exactly where they had described, at the stair foot, meetly deep under the ground, under a great heap of stones. Of course, there would have been a degree of subsidence of the ground over a period of 200 years, and it is not likely that the chest was originally buried as deep as 10 feet below the surface. Nevertheless, the common practice of medieval stonemasons was to fill in the hollow beneath a staircase with stones and rubble. This place of burial was probably chosen because of the privacy of the turret enclosing the stairs, which was a private way for the monarch's use. Tyrrell's assistants had apparently dug a hole in the ground and then made a recess inward into the foundations of the staircase. If these skeletons were not those of the princes, then their discovery in this particular place was an astonishing coincidence. In the light of later forensic evidence, it has been claimed by several revisionists that these bones could have belonged to any historical period. In the 1970s, it was suggested that they could have even been Roman, given the tower's long history. This cannot be so. The bones were discovered with pieces of rag and velvet about them, according to information given to the author by a textile expert contacted through the Archaeological Resource Center in York. Velvet was invented in the 1400s in Renaissance Italy, and was not made in England before the 16th century. In the 1480s, the wearing of imported velvets was restricted to persons of the highest rank, not only because it was so expensive, but also because of the social conventions then prevailing. Even in the 17th century, velvet was a costly material, available only to the well-to-do. The children whose bones were found in 1674 must therefore have been well-born and must have died in the 15th century at the earliest. They could not have been Roman because no material resembling velvet existed at the time. As no other pair of well-born children had disappeared in the tower during the previous 200 years, it is a fair assumption, forensic evidence aside, that these were indeed the bones of the princess. The eyewitnesses who saw the bones unearthed says that on that day they were carefully put aside in a stone coffin or coffer. It is thought that they had been damaged to some extent by the tools used by the workmen during their excommunication. Then it seems they were left along a pile of builders' rubbish on the site for a time, whilst news of their discovery was sent to King Charles II. It also appears that several people removed some of the bones as souvenirs at this time, and replaced them with animal bones from the rubbish heap. Eventually, the king ordered that the skeletons be examined by the royal surgeon and a panel of experienced antiquaries, whatever, all of whom declared they were satisfied that the remains were indeed those of princes. According to Camden's Britannica, 1695 edition, the bones remained in the Tower for 4 years, except for some few that were secured as curiosities by Elias Ashmole and sent to Ashmolean Museum in Oxford. In 1678, Charles II asked Sir Christopher Wren to provide a white marble coffin for the supposed bodies of the 2 princes. The bones were translated from the Tower to Westminster Abbey and decently interred, according to Camden, under a curious altar of black and white marble, which may still be seen today, bearing the inscription, "Here lie interred the remains of Edward V, King of England, and Richard, Duke of York, whose long desired and much sought out after bones, after above 190 years, were found by most certain tokens deep interred under the rubbish of the stairs that led up to the chapel of the White Tower on the 17th of July in the year of our Lord 1674. Charles II, a most merciful prince, having compassion upon their hard fortune, performed the funeral rites of these unhappy princes among the tombs of their ancestors. Anno Domini 1678. It is not known what the most certain tokens that facilitated the identification of the bodies were, only that they were accepted as sufficiently convincing by those most qualified to judge at the time. Those bones that had been sent to Ashmolean Museum were recorded in a 17th century catalogue of the museum's treasures. But in 1728, when the celebrated antiquarian Thomas Hearne went there and asked to see the bones, the keeper, Mr. Whiteside, could not find them. All he could say was that he had seen them and remembered them as being very small, particularly the finger bones. In 1933, a search was made in the museum for the bones, but they were not found. During the first part of the 20th century, strong pressure was brought to bear up the authorities of Westminster Abbey to have the urn containing the supposed bones of the princess opened and its contents re-examined in the light of new advances in medical science. The Abbey was, and still is, a royal peculiar, which means that both the sovereign and the Home Secretary have to give permission for any of the tombs to be opened. In 1933, George V, bowing to public opinion, finally authorized the opening of the urn, and an examination of the bones therein was carried out in the Abbey precincts by Dr. Lawrence E. Tanner, an eminent physician, archivist, and keeper of the monuments at Westminster Abbey, and Professor W. Wright, a dental surgeon who was president of the Anatomical Society of Great Britain. Tanner's report on their findings was published in Archaeologia in 1934. Tanner and Wright found, to begin with, that the urn contained all kinds of bones, including animal bones, which probably came from the rubbish heap on the excavation site at the Tower. Once the human bones were separated from these, Tanner and Wright discovered they had the incomplete skeletons of 2 children, the elder 4 foot 10 inches tall, and the younger 4 foot 6.5 inches tall. Both were of slender build, with very small finger bones. Using dental evidence, they estimated that the elder child was 12 to 13 years old, Edward V had been 12 years and 10 months in September 1483, and the younger 9 to 11 years old. York was 10 in September 1483. Because the bones were pre-pubertal, their sex could not be established, nor could the age of the bones. Wright stated that the elder child had certainly suffered from extensive chronic bone disease, probably osteomyelitis, affecting both sides of the lower jaw. This could not fail to have affected his general health, causing painful swelling and inflammation of the lower gums, making the patient miserable and irritable. In the light of this evidence, it is significant that Dr. Argentine was attending Edward V shortly before his disappearance. Both Argentine and Moore confirmed that the boy was then sunk in apathy and depression, which may have been partly due to the discomfort in his jaw. Wright stated also that the structure of the jaws and bones in each skeleton indicated a familial link, and further claimed that a red stain on the facial bones of the elder child was a blood stain caused by suffocation. What? Tanner and Wright felt that there were too many coincidences between the evidence of the bones and the evidence of history. Who else could these bones belong to but the princes? Wright thought the evidence more conclusive than could, considering everything, reasonably have been accepted. This was a blow to those revisionists who had questioned the 17th century identification of the skeletons, for, as the report concluded, if they were those of the princes, by no possibility could either or both have been still alive on August 22nd, 1485, the day of Bosworth. In other words, on the basis of the children's ages, at the time of their death, it was likely that they had died in 1483, and that Moore's account of their deaths came very near to the truth, since the evidence that the bones in the urn are those of the princes is as conclusive as could be desired. Since 1934, there have been several attempts to discredit the findings of Tanner and Wright. In the 1970s and 1980s, the Richard III Society made several unsuccessful attempts to persuade the Dean and Chapter of Westminster Abbey to apply for royal permission to re-exhume the bones for further tests, on the grounds that significant scientific advances since 1933 could now establish the ages of the children with greater accuracy. New chemical tests could perhaps determine their sex. Radiocarbon dating could estimate the age of the bones to within 25 years, and biochemical analysis could resolve the vexed question of whether the facial stain on the elder child's skull is in fact blood. The Dean and Chapter, however, are reluctant to disturb the royal bones within their precincts, and do not consider a new examination either desirable or worthwhile. Medical experts called upon in recent years to examine the forensic evidence for the identification of the skeletons have therefore had to rely on the report and photographs of Wright and Tanner. Within these constraints, there now exists a substantial body of medical opinion on the subject. In 1955, Richard III's revisionist biographer, Paul Murray Kendall, enlisted the assistance of 4 experts. Dr. W. M. Krogman, professor of physical anthropology in the Graduate School of Medicine of the University of Pennsylvania, Dr. Arthur Lewis, an orthodontist of Dayton, Ohio, Professor Bertram S. Krause of the Department of Perkins of Godalming. Professor Bertram S. Krause of the Department of Anthropology of the University of Arizona, and Dr. Richard Lyne Perkins of Godalming, Surrey. Professor A. R. Myers, the eminent medieval historian canvassed the opinion of Professor R.G. Harrison, professor of anatomy at the University of Liverpool. In 1978, Elizabeth Jenkins, author of The Princess in the Tower, obtained an opinion from Mr. F. M. Lind, BDS, Lond, LDS, RCS, English, while in 1981 the late Professor Charles Ross, author of the most outstanding biography of Richard III, sought the opinions of Dr. Juliet Rogers, a specialist in the study of ancient bones, Dr. J. H. Musgrove, an anatomist, and Professor E. W. Bradford, a professor of dental surgery, Dr. Jean Ross, senior lecturer in anatomy at Charing Cross Hospital Medical School, gave evidence at the television trial of Richard III in 1984, and in 1987 there was a lively debate between the Times archaeology correspondent Norman Hammond, Dr. Thea Molliston, and Mr. William White in the correspondence columns of the Times on the subject of the bones in the urn. The findings of the experts were in all cases consistent with the bones being those of the princes in the Tower. Although some questioned the findings of Tanner and Wright, they did not discredit them. Indeed, their conclusions substantiated them. With regard to the age of the children, most of the experts prefer to rely on the dental evidence, which mostly showed that the age of the elder child was at least 11 years and at most 13 years. The age of the younger child was more difficult to determine, but was within the range of 7 to 11.5 years. These findings were consistent with the deaths of the children occurring in September 1483. Dr. Ross found indications of a blood relationship between the skeletons in the bones of the skull, and the number and type of permanent teeth missing, a condition known as hypodontia. Dr. Mollison agreed that these factors were strongly suggestive of kinship between one more time, please. Dr. Mollison agreed that these factors were strongly suggestive of kinship because of the rarity of such bone formations. William Wright disputed this on the grounds that research showed this was true of modern skeletons, but not of 17th century Londoners. But Dr. Mollison had compared her findings with tests carried out on medieval skeletons found in Winchester, in which the incidence of hypodontia was the same as it is today. Dr. Mollison also concluded that there was every likelihood of a blood relationship with Anne Mowbray, York's wife, and a third cousin of the princess, whose bones had been subjected to forensic tests in 1965, and whose permanent teeth were also incomplete. Dr. Mollison was the only expert to pronounce on the sex of the children, it being agreed by the rest that it was extremely hard to ascertain the gender of pre-pubertal skeletons. He compared the dental and skeletal maturity of Anne Mowbray's bones with the bones in the urn and concluded that the later were probably both prepubescent boys. All the experts agreed that the age of the bones could not be determined from the evidence available to them. Dr. Juliet Rogers stated that the most that could be said was that the children died before 1674, and added that they could even be Roman. As we have seen, if one accepts the textile evidence, this could not have been so. None of the experts were able to determine the cause of death. Dr. Ross and Dr. Lynn Purkis could find no evidence of any facial bloodstain on the elder child, but Dr. Krogman did concede that the mark there could have been blood resulting from the rupturing of vessels during suffocation, even though it was usually only facial tissues that were damaged in such circumstances. Dr. Musgrove agreed that there might be a bloodstain, but stated that proof could only be obtained by biochemical analysis. The weight of medical evidence may not be conclusive, but it in no way excludes the likelihood that these bones were those of the ill-fated princess in the tower. Indeed, it corroborates Sir Thomas More's evidence and the findings of Wright and Tanner, and in its own right strongly suggests that the original identification of the bones in the 17th century was correct. No other pair of boys of rank disappeared in the Tower between 1483 and 1674. To suggest otherwise is really a stretch to coincidence too far. It is true that the medical evidence presently available does not identify the cause of death of the children nor their murderer. Nevertheless, it confirms that if these were the princes, and there is no reason to suppose otherwise, then they were dead by the end of 1483. And if that is the case, given all the other evidence already discussed in previous chapters, then only one man could have been responsible for their deaths: Richard III. And that concludes Weir's book, The Princess in the Tower. Allison has other books too. One I have in my possession on Elizabeth of York, which maybe we'll get into too. I gotta say, when I first came across an awareness of a character known as Richard III, it was, of course, through Shakespeare. Oh my God, that must be 1996. And yeah, I was, I had watched the Laurence Olivier movie, and then I read the works, and I picked up this book around 1999, I think it was, 2000, 1999, 2000, something like that. Through the, yeah. Anyway, I had no reason to really doubt the guilt of Richard III, but I'll say, despite this work, which is extensive in its research and I guess, well written, I'm not entirely convinced. I see reasons for both the bones and the information and the witnesses, and for it all to be like scrambled, removed, eliminated, turned over, disguised, stolen, for other reasons other than to hide Richard III's guilt in the matter. And the one, and I'm not saying I'm convinced either way, but I would say that the one point that stands out most in my mind is the legitimacy of Henry VII falling to the wayside if the princes themselves were, in fact, left to live. Who's to say that Richard III didn't truly take his job as their protectorate seriously and was, either disguising them, removing them from the court, hiding them away for their own protection, whatever. Maybe their hiding away in the tower wasn't the only place they ended up. I think the question can still stand. Although this chapter wraps up with a very strong assertion on on well, on the author's position. Um, I'm sorry, no, I, I'm not sure. I feel as strongly as Allison does about it, but I'm just one guy. Um, sure, there's a lot of information, and it's important to remember that this book is well. Let's consider something else too. I mean, the research goes on. Okay, this yeah. You know, this book is over 30 years old. Hard to believe. Wow, time flies. Um, but a lot of things have been investigated, and since then, it's interesting that I'll never forget the time I stumbled upon the YouTube video. It was probably originally presented on television, but where they found Richard III's remains, and that was really something. That was special too. They did an artist's rendition of his face by, you know, the that process they use using I guess it's plasticine and clays, reconstructing the face over the skull to get a likeness. That was something. That was really something. Um, Although I felt the rendition they did kind of looked a lot like someone else in history too. It looked a lot like um, um, Lorenzo the Magnificent in Medici, Italy, during the yeah, and not it didn't look like all the renditions of that particular character, but it did look like one I had seen. I think it was made of wood. Some of the people out there might be familiar with it, but I don't know. The possibilities are endless. I don't know enough about this to give a strong opinion either way, but it's one of those kind of things that can really suck you in and provoke research. But anyway, just the same, enjoyed the read. Um, that wraps up this one. But some may notice that some of the videos are void in this playlist from the rest of Allison's book here. But I'll be sure to put those in and get all the chapters together eventually. Um, anyway, hope you got something out of this, and thanks for checking it out. Stay well. Have a good one.